In the wake of George Floyd's murder and subsequent protests in downtown Asheville, city and county leaders committed to reparations resolutions to repay and repair systemic and historic harms to Black people.
New tonight, Buncombe County passes a resolution to support reparations for Black people in Buncombe County.
This comes weeks after the city of Asheville made nationwide headlines for passing a similar vote.
That was 3 years ago. While city council and county commissioners have steered a few $1 million into the commitment, reparations commissioners are still deep in the process of defining and detailing what exactly reparations will look like. Even the initial call for reparations was intentionally vague.
So we wanted to take advantage of this moment in time, get this radical legislation passed, and that allow us time to more plan out the specific outcomes and deliverables that we wanted to receive. But it gives us the ability to have this massive amount of political capital stored within this legislation.
I'm Matt Piken. My guest today is Rob Thomas, Executive Director of the Racial Justice Coalition of Asheville. We talk about the steps he helped pave toward a local reparations resolution and his advocacy for doing it right rather than doing it fast. We also get into why some demands in the resolution are more challenging to achieve than others. And Rob points to some ways the city could leverage its real estate holdings to make good on some promises in the resolution. Advertisements don't sound like ads on the Overlook. They sound like conversations, because they are. Take it from one of my earliest sponsors, Jennifer Goodyear of Davidia Realty.
That was really easy, and I felt really comfortable doing this ad with you. And I'm enjoying it so much that I do want to buy more.
If you market a business or even yourself, make a great impression by advertising on Asheville's hottest show. You can be a sponsor of The Overlook for as little as $100. Ask to learn more by messaging me at matt@podavl.com. That's podavl.com. I began my conversation with Rob Thomas by asking the substance of any conversations between local Black leaders and elected officials around equity and reparations before the events of 2020.
So it was more or less a behind-the-scenes conversation or argument, really. And when everything happened May 25th with George Floyd and the following months, that provided a platform for things of that nature to come forward and see some light.
You said it was an argument. What was the substance of whatever argument was happening before all that happened?
Yes, for me, I would say the biggest argument at the systemic level is the disparities within all the systems, whether it's education, economic mobility, housing, criminal justice, public health, like whatever you could think of, even environmental justice, where Black people are subject to brown zones and food deserts and other things.
Those are a lot of issues you just touched on in a single sentence. So these are big issues. Were you seeing a lot of either resistance at the local leadership level to the things you were pointing out, you and your colleagues were pointing out, or was it about you had different ways of going about addressing these issues? What was it?
Yeah, I would say the argument was over the amount of resources that gets diverted to each of the issues that I outlined, and resources in the form of people or capital. And after we got the platform that was the summer of 2020, we got a lot more attention and a lot more resources got diverted to the issues that I outlined.
So obviously the events in 2020 were unfortunate is an understatement to say that nobody wanted to see them happen, yet it seemed like it opened up gates of awareness that you're talking about at a city level that weren't open before.
Well, it's kind of like a perfect storm. When you look at the complete environment of 2020, you had coronavirus also in full effect. You had individuals with no employment, not really certain of what was going to happen in the future, and the world slowed down where a lot of us were still quarantining and lockdowns and things of that nature, and people couldn't avoid some of the things that were happening in media. And yeah, people were able to mobilize because now they've got disposable time to be able to address the issues.
What issues did you feel got the most traction from your vantage point in the wake of the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter protests that happened around that?
I would say, when that happened in a few months, surrounding that whole incident, the state of black people in America got looked at. And then also you had other racist situations that was getting spotlights as well, whether it was Japanese Americans, Native Americans, or our Hispanics or Latinx population as well.
Did you find a certain kismet or coalition with these other ethnic and racial groups developing in the wake of this?
Yes, it was a little bit of both and. That was a lot of unity that was created. That was also dissent as well. So it was a little bit of both and. I would say from my vantage point, I felt like that was a larger amount of support.
Yeah, I would think there would be a double-edged sword to that. Tell me if I'm wrong in this, that while there's strength in numbers that develops from that and some shared pain that other ethnic and racial groups are experiencing, yet black people and brown people and Asians and other ethnic and racial minorities here all face different issues. Did you feel in some ways that the things that you and the Racial Justice Coalition were fighting for, that there was a threat to water those things down by having interests of other groups be lumped in there as well?
I would have to say, yeah, that's always a threat when you're working within collective liberation. But just looking at the history and how that has played out historically, you can prepare and plan to avoid that from happening or do the best to avoid it from happening. But in my opinion, that is always a risk where, one demographic of the collective gains more of a voice than the rest of the demographic. Sometimes it can veer away from the voices or demographics that the whole campaign started out with.
And especially how you explained at the very beginning of this conversation that it's not a top-down structure at the Racial Justice Coalition, that it sounds like it's consensus building.
Yes, I would say that is exactly correct. Although, I'll be the first to admit that there's also an invisible power dynamic of, I've been at the coalition, I was the first employee, and just the seniority thing. But the way that I address that is always make individuals feel comfortable to voice their opinions. And I say repeatedly, hey, just because I've been here the longest doesn't matter. Everybody's ideas are important.
Yeah.
Give individuals a voice.
You talked about how in 2020, between the pandemic and the George Floyd murder and the protests around that, opened up some resources in the city. What did you see some movement on in a way that you thought, oh, this is hopeful? Where did you see local leadership taking at least steps to address more so than others? What was coming forward in your eyes?
For me, I received satisfaction from it for a different reason. The reason being that they were looking at all the issues more seriously at the same time. Instead of continuously applying Band-Aids to a more serious wound, there's an opportunity or a potential to get more done to rectify each situation. So when you ask me that, you're thinking about all the programs that have been created and implemented for the different focus areas that I outlined previously. And I would say each field has a nice amount. Just looking at criminal justice and the money that the federal government infused in it, which trickled down to the state government, and the task force that was created around police accountability and the criminal justice system in general, and then the funding that the city has infused and grants that the city has written itself, like the MacArthur grant, which is funding a community-led violence interruption initiative. And I could outline different programs that I would say would be ripple effects from all the movement work that we did in 2020. It's an extremely long list.
So funding has come in through these efforts of yours and the city supporting them to some degree.
I can't necessarily say the funding has come in. Funding's always been there. It's just now it's getting directed to places that has needed attention for a long time. The RJC, what we do is we advocate and influence systemic change through advocating and uplifting the voices of the community. So at best, we're advocating for policy change or programs to be implemented.
One of the things that you were advocating for strongly was reparations. And when the city council voted to say, yes, we will have reparations in the city without defining at that time what that looked like, were you surprised that the city council actually passed a resolution to enact reparations?
No, I can't say that I was because it was a very strategic plan with me and previous councilman Keith Young, who's also one of my closest colleagues in the work. We still do a whole lot of work together. But yeah, me and him behind the scenes strategized and planned that whole thing out. I was getting information about different council members' disposition, and they were all very supportive. They were more concerned about the protest and possible destruction of downtown Asheville, and they were more or less looking for something that could potentially appease the community members and lessen the tension. Some of the protests had become violent, whereas individuals had thrown debris at law enforcement. Law enforcement had also used tear gas and other methods that the community deemed was unjustified.
You're talking about specifically the protests in the wake of the George Floyd murder.
Yeah.
So are you saying then, because this was top of mind, that city council in part approved reparations as a way to mollify, to appease the people behind the protests?
Yes. I guess I'll explain something that I probably haven't really explained publicly before, how that whole process happened. I would say maybe a day or so after the June 6th protest, which was the extremely large protest downtown, me and Keith Young started communicating and talking a little bit about the current state of things and what could be done. And one day over the phone, the subject of reparations, it came up because that was one of the demands that I had presented to the city staff and the police chief on June 6th. It was a total of 8 demands. And we started thinking about what would need to happen to actually move that forward and what that would look like. And so we came up with a plan to use the social capital and political capital that was currently being created from all the movement and momentum of the protests. And we were pretty much waiting for it to reach a point of critical mass, more or less, because we could see that things were still spiraling up a little bit. Behind the scenes, I'm working with Black Asheville Demands and other organizers, and we're keeping up the momentum and the pressure. And Keith was like, okay, the RJC had created a way to mobilize our supporters a lot more quicker. We had created a listserv where we could send email alerts and let people know what actions to take. And we had a plan to send all of our energy towards a city council with emails and telephone calls. And we were waiting to push the button to write, like I said, when everything reaches critical mass, and we were going to demand reparations. At this point in time, that same week, where the RJC pushed the button on that, so to speak, Keith Young then presented the rough draft of the reparations resolution to his council member colleagues at a city council check-in before a city council meeting. And they edited, they made some changes to it. Some of them made the document stronger, some of them made it a little bit weaker in my opinion, but then it was presented at that next city council meeting. So that's why you asked me, was I surprised that it was passed unanimously? It was like, no, because I knew that they all had a hand, whether it was a large hand in the creation of it or a small, they all had the opportunity to input, alter, or make changes to the document before it was presented at that city council meeting.
So you mentioned that the reparations were one of 8 demands. Can you run down what some of the other demands were at this time?
I'm going to be honest, it was a long list, so I don't remember all 7. Okay. But some of the other demands was like removal of racist monuments. One of the outcomes was removal of the Vance Monument, obviously. The other one was related to police accountability. The offspring of that was reimagining public safety. Another one was renaming the streets named after racist slaveholders. That one didn't move all the way through. Another demand was cutting the police budget. That one is complicated. I guess on paper, it looks as if they cut the police budget, but they literally just fired the dog catcher and then used that money to create a different position inside of a different department at the city and moved a few people around and moved some funding around. But technically, if you ask me, they didn't defund the police, and it wasn't ever, to me, that's not the language I was using. I was using divest and invest. And the most important piece of that is the investment that comes along with the divestment, because the investment is the piece that decreases the rate of crime. And that's when you invest in community programs and initiatives to interrupt violence. It's when you invest in the infrastructure of that community to increase economic mobility and all the other social determinants of health.
If you own or run the marketing of a business in this region, nonprofit or for-profit, podcasting is a unique, engaging way to tell your story. These are called branded podcasts. Your company owns the show, and I'm here to help you put one together. It might be a short series or an ongoing production. You already know about the years of great work I did in public radio and now here with The Overlook. I also want to work for you through my studio, Podcast Asheville. Email me at matt@podavl.com. That's podavl.com. Let's talk and see how I can help you meet your marketing goals with a podcast that's all your own. You mentioned that the reparations document, the reparations resolution, you and Keith Young had a strong hand, or at least the primary hand, in crafting originally. What ended up passing in that resolution in terms of some of the details that you think are the key points of any reparations conclusion and fulfillment of reparations? What were some of the elements of this resolution?
Well, you got to look at the whole nature of the resolution itself, why it was created, to even understand the elements thereof. So the reason why me and Keith wanted this legislation to be passed was because it was going to give us the ability to put a placeholder on that moment in time. Again, what I was explaining to you earlier, how crisis and movements and things of that nature work, is there's a peak, and then after you reach that peak, support and attention kind of dwindles and veers off. So we wanted to take advantage of this moment in time, get this radical legislation passed, and that allow us time to more plan out the specific outcomes and deliverables that we wanted to receive. But it gives us the ability to have this massive amount of political capital stored within this legislation.
But the potential danger of something like that is it could be so vague that passing it doesn't necessarily bind the city to anything.
Exactly.
So give me a sense of, were there specifics that made you feel hopeful, or did you feel at the time that it was a little too vague and left too much room for the city to not act either in a timely way or in a specific way?
I would say that in a way we intentionally left it vague, because what we didn't want to do was create something so large without community buy-in and community support and community input. So that's what this was all about, slowing things down, bringing community in, giving them the leadership and decision-making positions within the entity and the structure itself, and allow it to evolve in whatever ways it can evolve. Now, of course, the Racial Justice Coalition is always on the perimeter of this process, assisting the commissioners themselves, whether it's helping connect them with the community or giving them a voice and a platform to get things that they disagree with rectified. Or it could be information sharing and support in the form of our volunteers showing up and supporting in different ways, whether it's research related or taking notes, for instance.
So are you on this reparations committee?
No, I'm not. I specifically didn't apply or anything. For one, I feel like it would have been a slight conflict of interest with me being in an executive director role at the Racial Justice Coalition and then also being on the commission itself.
Why would that be a conflict of interest? Because it seems it's a compatible interest.
Yes.
Well, how is that a conflict of interest?
They created some policies when they created the commission. One of the policies was if you were an executive director of an organization, there were some stipulations like you couldn't receive money from the city or do other things of that nature, and which my organization doesn't currently receive any money from the city. But they were just throwing in, after people had applied, they were throwing in some roadblocks, I would say, and just it didn't really interest me to be on the inside of it. I felt like my role was directing the support on the outside, and I had faith and trust in the community members that would get chosen to be within that commission. I also knew that I didn't have a lot of capacity to do everything that I need to do within my role at the RJC, and also do a really good job at being a commission member.
Gotcha. So now that you've seen the makeup of this commission and how it's evolved it's been about 2 years now since the reparations vote, I think, somewhere around there. Were you happy with the makeup of the commission?
That's a tricky question. I can't say that. So yes, like I appreciate every commissioner that is on that commission. But if to answer this specific question, I'd have to go back to how we even got to there in the first place. And after the city created their different phases plan, phase 1, 2, and 3, and came up with their plan to create the Reparations Commission itself, they also wanted to appoint all the commissioners themselves. Like, they wanted to have the ability to select every individual that would be a commission member on there. And that's when the RJC, we started advocating, and we used our listserv and mobilized individuals to create awareness and influence a different outcome, which the compromise was 13 of the commissioners were selected by community members, by neighborhood associations, and 12 of the individuals were selected by elected officials.
Are you happy with how that ended up?
I would say, on hindsight is 2020, at the point in time, no, I was not happy. I wanted 100% of the commission selected by the community, of course. But like I said, I appreciate every commissioner that has taken part in that process.
Since you're not on the committee, you may not have the best view of this, but since your organization is entirely about this kind of issue, what have you seen that's come out of this commission? I'm sure you're talking to people on this commission about the actions or lack thereof, or the detours that it has taken. Tell me how it's gone since the commitment to have reparations. What's your view of the progress and what's coming off the table from this commission?
The progress, I would say, is also slow, in my opinion. And that's inherent inside of a bureaucratic structure that is municipal government. But there's also been some complications that have slowed the process down that I believe could have been avoided.
Such as?
Such as the consultant, Deborah Jones Clark. She ended up having to transfer the contract itself to another business because she didn't have the capacity and time to do a full-time job. She's president of the college, and she didn't have the capacity to attend the meetings and do a lot of the administrative type duties that were described in the scope of work that she had given to the city. So she ended up trading the contract, but that also slowed down the process because work wasn't getting done. And I'm not saying that to blame her or down her, because she did a great job. I think that coming back and forth from where she was geographically coming from and still attending meetings and still facilitating the process in the way that she did was beneficial, and things were moving forward. But again, I always have to say that it's very hard to completely satisfy me. And you asked the question about what was the progress.
You said you and Keith Young had a deliberate strategy to keep things vague in the beginning so that something could get on the table.
So vague with safeguards.
Vague with safeguards. I would imagine after this much time, you'd be wanting to see some real sharp specifics about how reparations would look. Now, while nothing has been passed yet or enacted, what are you hearing about details that we are likely to see in any action toward reparations?
I think that some of the immediate recommendations that the impact focus area reparation commission groups are working on are actually public information and on the city's website. But within each focus area, different recommendations are being prepared to be brought forward. Some of them are in rough draft form. I know that they have not figured out all of the recommendations that they want to present from every impact focus area, but some of them have moved forward in requesting.
Can you give us a rundown or at least a summary of some of the specifics you're seeing that align with your values and the organization's values, the RJC's values?
Well, one of the recommendations that I looked over was pertaining to the education system and the disparity presented in the demographics of the makeup of the staff, and some programs that they were wanting to get implemented to decrease the disparity of white and black teachers and the retention thereof. Like I said, I want to say this is one of the ones that is not finalized, and I don't think they have submitted any of them to the city yet. They're still internally working on things. Again, the process has been slowed down because a lot of these impact focus areas are actually waiting on data from the city to be able to finalize recommendations. So a lot of what we're getting right now is the rough drafts of what they can create with the information and data that they currently possess while waiting on further data.
I think a lot of people are probably confused about what reparations would be. A lot of people, that's why I'm asking for specifics of what you're seeing that either might be likely or even just specifics in what will be presented for vote at City Council. A lot of people think, does that just mean cash to black residents? What is the scope of specific reparations? How does that look? And I think that's an open question. A lot of people are curious about that. I'm hoping you can clarify.
Yes, I most definitely can clarify that. When you look at the resolution itself, it outlines a very long list of harms. Some of them I had spoken of previously during this conversation, as far as redlining, urban renewal, block busting, steering, a whole host of things dealing with housing, disparities pertaining to public health, justice, with convict leasing, and a whole host of things. To me, and this is just my opinion, and reparations has to be created because one of the requirements for reparations is satisfaction of the harmed party. And so the harmed party is actually a large amount of people, and so it requires a lot of input. But to me, reparations would equal addressing and remedying the outcomes and effects of the harms that were done to us that were outlined within that resolution. And that's just the ones that the city and municipal government were culpable for.
Are there specific things you mentioned about teachers and having more equity in classrooms? What other specifics are you seeing that we will see in the public probably brought in terms of final, if not to the letter, what the final recommendations will be? Just give us a sense of what area, what are you seeing? Like, are they talking about a certain funding element for public health? Is there a certain jolt of money for black business? Give us a sense of what could likely be included in a final resolution.
So there's a few things going on, but if you ask me in my opinion, I guess one of the biggest immediate recommendations would probably be asking for the land that was taken through urban renewal that was placed under moratorium that the RJC back in 2020, directly after the resolution was unanimously signed, we then immediately advocated that all land taken through urban renewal be placed within a moratorium so that it could not be sold or transferred to any other parties, in hopes so that it could be placed under control of the Reparations Commission when it was created. So one of the recommendations coming from the housing impact focus area actually involves that and that land being quantified and then placed under control of the commission itself to be a part of addressing some of the harms that were outlined within the resolution. And there's a few issues that I foresee coming up with this recommendation. One, the city owns about 70 acres currently of the land that was taken through urban renewal. Out of this 70 acres, only about 3 acres of it is unoccupied or not in use of by the city. I would be very shocked for the city to just say, okay, we own 70 acres and we're going to give you all 70 back. When you've got buildings like the fire department, the police department, the public works building, like all these buildings were properties that were taken from black people while implementing urban renewal. I also like to outline that even that is an extreme compromise just because these 70 acres that the city owns, like that's only a fraction of what was taken through urban renewal. Remember, at the beginning, I stated that this is land that was taken through urban renewal that the city currently still owns. A lot of it has been privatized and sold. So even them just compensating for the 70 acres that they currently own is already an extreme compromise. So I would say that would be the simplest and easiest and most logical situation to remedy until more data is presented.
It seems like to me, Rob, that while you will say things are going slower than you would have liked, you also seem, from what I'm hearing from you, patient to some degree, and you have a long view of this, that you think in the end that there will be some movement on this. How much time do you think realistically we're looking at before anything is voted on, approved, and actually put into place? Are we looking at years ahead? What do you think?
If you look at the resolution, look at the harms that are outlined, none of these things are easily fixed situations where you can push a button and now the racial wealth gap is decreasing or disappeared. Or if we just do this one thing right here in the school system, now the opportunity/achievement gap has been cut in half. These issues are serious issues, but we have all the evidence to show where these were created from systemic injustices.
Do you think by having a 25-member committee, that makes it more difficult to, that seems like a huge committee, to make it more difficult to say, yes, this is what we're presenting to city council? Seems like the more people you have, the more people are throwing things in that could gum up the works.
Yeah, there is an old adage, you don't want too many chefs in the kitchen. But at the end of the day, I actually wish that there was exponentially more community involvement. The nature of the decisions that are being made within the structure could potentially impact a lot of lives for the good, for the betterment of the community. And I'm the type of individual, I think completely out of the box. If you ask me, if it was me, I would have structured the process completely differently, where there wasn't so much bureaucracy, there wasn't so much focus on process resembling traditional processes, but it would be more focused on the environment, the collection of information and information sharing. That would be a whole lot more community engagement and community involvement. And they are moving forward with some of the community engagement. Arteria, or that used to be Writers in Schools, they are now working with the Reparations Commission, and the RJC definitely looks at them as an ally. I personally have a lot of respect for Sekou Coleman and a lot of the others who are part of that. So again, you know, I have faith that things will change. But yeah, I would rather it be figured out how to involve more community members than look at it as we need less.
Interesting. Lastly, what is the RJC focusing on outside of reparations right now? What are some of the hot plate issues that you're going forward with right now?
I would say the next hot plate issue would probably be the tax inequities. We've also been doing a lot of work with Urban 3. So Urban 3 is an organization that studies tax inequities and the tax system in general and outlines the disparities of different demographics. And not specifically racial, but a lot of it has to do with financial status and the inequities and how appraisals and the tax system, I would say, charges more money to certain citizens than others. And looking at it with Urban 3, it has a lot to do with the formula that the appraiser uses. And to give you a for instance, say you've got a $4 million property in Biltmore Forest. This property in Biltmore Forest is being taxed at, let's say, $30 per acre. You've got a property in West Asheville that is 3-bedroom house, and you look at it, it's being taxed at $330 per acre. Another way that you can look and see a lot of disparities is in the way that the houses themselves are appraised. Again, this $4 million house in Biltmore Forest actually goes on the market and is sold for $13 million. So there's a $9 million difference in taxes that the city should, or the county should have been collecting from this property owner per year that is not being collected. There's also legislation that gives the county the ability to go back and collect these quote-unquote back taxes after the sale of the property. But in most cases, that doesn't happen. The individuals selling these properties have a lot of resources and ability to get lawyers and fight.
Yeah. So you're working on equity in housing appraisals. What else are you working on?
Yeah, I'm also a part of another initiative that is the Reparations Stakeholder Authority of Asheville. And it's me and 3 other individuals who are on the what we call the design team for this initiative. Me, Keith Young, Libby Cowles, and Marsha Davis.
This sounds like another reparations commission in a way that's working parallel to the official reparations commission.
It's different and can do some of the things that the city's process cannot do, where they are in a bind with not being able to do anything that is declared race-positive discrimination. Or I wouldn't say they were in a bind. That's a whole other conversation. I believe they should go through the court proceedings. All the evidence is there to show where race-positive discrimination would be justified to remedy the outcomes of the harms named. But again, back to the RSA, it is a private structure that has the ability to allocate funding and specifically focus on a very specific demographic of the population, which is black people. It also has the ability to collect funding in a diverse form and fashion, whether it is in-kind donations in the form of human capital or money. And back to another question you had asked me earlier that was related to the ending of the commission. From my understanding right now, which I have heard Brad Branham state at a Reparations Commission meeting, they're expecting the commission to continue on after the long-term recommendations are submitted. They're not looking at this commission to just wrap up, or to do this quote-unquote job and then wrap up. Again, like I said, if you look at the harms that were outlined, I don't think that they could fully be solved within a decade, less known within 3-4 years.
That's exactly what I was asking a little bit ago. If you think this timeline, is this something that can just be a can kicked down the road in perpetuity?
It could be, yes. Without proper accountability and without proper public awareness to the situation that's going on, That's exactly what could happen, because commissions, from my understanding, speaking to political scientists and other electeds as in a kind of informal form and fashion, commissions are created for two reasons: either to speed something along and move it forward, or to slow something down until it dies.
And which do you think is happening here?
Of course, the intent was to slow this down and let it die. But if you've got the right community support, if you've got the right attention, and you've got community influencers who are keeping an eye on the process, it makes it a lot harder to do that.
Do you think the public, by and large, is still behind you and behind this effort?
I would say that the majority of the individuals who supported it in the beginning in 2020 are still supportive thereof of it. It's just now you can't physically see the support because people aren't standing in the streets with signs and making a whole lot of communications on social media and things of that nature. Of course, it has went down. That's the nature of movement. That's the nature of trends. Things are trending, and then support falls off a little bit. But I still believe that within Asheville, there is still a large amount of individuals who support what it is that we're trying to accomplish here.
I want to thank my guest today, Rob Thomas of the Racial Justice Coalition of Asheville. If you have thoughts about today's topic, I'd love to hear them and maybe pull them into a future episode of The Overlook. Just leave a voice message on our recorded line, 984-278-7301. Today's conversation happened inside the BB Theater in downtown Asheville, which owners Susan and Giles Collard have been so gracious enough to open to me to record my interviews. Our theme music for The Overlook, Maker's Song, comes courtesy of the Asheville band The Resonant Rogues. The Overlook is a production of Podcast Asheville. New episodes are online by 6 a.m. every weekday wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our weekly newsletter at podavl.com. I'm Matt Peiken, and I'll see you on the next episode of The Overlook.